Global warming is not only the #1 environmental challenge we face today, but one of the most important issues facing all of humanity. Leonardo DiCaprio, actor. Many of us know that the planet is warming because of increased greenhouse gases, that we don't know the exact consequences of that. Greta Thunberg, eco-activist. There is no convincing scientific evidence that anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases cause or may cause catastrophic heating of the Earth in the foreseeable future and the destruction of its climate. Frederick Seitz, former president of the U.S. Academy of Sciences, professor. Neither the rate nor the magnitude of the reported late 20th century surface warming 1979 to 2000 lay outside normal natural variability. Robert Carter, geologist. Every day, millions of people on the planet are suffering from climatic disasters. How is climate change being dealt with internationally today? What mechanisms are in place for this, and how do they work? Today, almost everyone on the planet has heard about the anthropogenic impact on the climate, about greenhouse gas emissions, and the global warming associated with them. The whole world is combating greenhouse gas emissions, while international organizations and countries are trying to influence climate change. But do you know exactly how it happens? In '97, a number of countries adopted a general agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. To enforce this decision, various countries have introduced economic mechanisms that encourage manufacturers to abandon fossil fuels. The primary mechanism is international emissions trading. Each country sets a limit, a cap, on the total amount of CO2 emissions they will allow each year. It is measured in carbon credits. A carbon credit is equal to 1 ton of CO2 emissions, and the right to release a certain amount of CO2 emissions is called a quota. Established quotas for greenhouse gas emissions are shared by industries and companies within the country. A manufacturer who has reduced their emissions and has not used a part of their quota can sell that portion of their carbon credits on an exchange. A manufacturer who has exceeded the quotas is required to buy them. It turns out that greenhouse gas emissions are a new commodity that is being bought and sold. The right to emit pollutants is traded on carbon exchanges similar to a stock market. This market generated $272 billion in revenues in the year 2020. Another mechanism for regulating CO2 emissions is a carbon tax. It is a fee levied on companies that burn fossil fuels. These taxes go to the budgets of countries, and each country decides where to allocate these funds. Now, what is the purpose of these market mechanisms, and how can trade and taxes help with climate change? The tax and quota on CO2 raises the cost of any commodity that is produced using carbon energy, and it also bumps up the price of the energy resources themselves. That is, hydrocarbon energy is being made so expensive that we just couldn't afford it. But do they give us anything in return? Humankind is offered to switch to the green energy, but there are certain questions. First, this kind of energy is unstable and cannot provide us with the necessary amount of energy. Secondly, it turns out that green energy is more expensive than hydrocarbon energy. Most interestingly, we still have to use the same hydrocarbons to produce the elements for green power plants. Additional climate taxation and the quota system bring good profits to various organizations in particular states. But in the end, who will pay for all this? The question is rhetorical. So what happens? We are destroying the existing energy industry, but we have not yet created a viable replacement. At the same time, this raises the price of the resource without which no person can survive. During this year, The price of CO2 emission quotas in Europe has doubled. As a result, prices on energy markets have risen as well. In October 2021, prices per megawatt of energy in Europe were 6 to 8 times higher than in 2020. Consequently, this affected the economic situation in the world, which had a direct impact on the well-being of every person. But back to the topic of climate. More than 20 years have passed since the Kyoto Protocol was signed. According to a report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, total climate finance for 2016 to 2019 amounted to $287 billion and is growing each year. Most of this financing was allocated to projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. According to the World Meteorological Organization, CO2 levels reached a critical point in 2020. After every international treaty, CO2 emissions have been measured, and we see that in 2021, despite enormous funding, the emissions curve is skyrocketing. There is another important point. Have all these measures helped solve the real climate problems? Do we see a reduction in the growth of natural disasters and weather anomalies? Has the ecological situation on the planet improved? Have we started to live in a safer and more comfortable world? Perhaps everyone should just look around and honestly answer all of these questions.
Hello, dear viewers. We see clearly that the economic mechanisms agreed by countries in Kyoto or Paris are not working, neither against the increasing pace of climate change,